Admin Camp Session 3, the one that I've been most excited about, reports and data visualization. Helen, would you clear the stamp? So today, today is day 3. We have had an overview of an intro to Apricot. We've gone through forms. Today we're going through reports and data visualization. We still have a couple other topics coming up. As a reminder, it's always good, I think, to do some introductions. My name is Heather Eckert. I will be your tour guide for reporting and data visualization today. Oops. And we also thought, in addition to reminding you our names, we'd also share our favorite ways to use reports. For me, I love reporting because it makes data visual. So you put so much time and effort into entering all that data meticulously into Apricot, and reports are a way to make it visible. It displays your data that you've worked so hard to collect, but also you can make it visual. You can add graphs and visuals and make it a little bit more engaging. So that's what I love. Helen, what is your favorite way to use reports?
Hello, everyone. Welcome. My favorite way is to embed a report in a bulletin. I'll pass it on to Janae.
Hi, everyone. I love reports, and my favorite part of reports is using them for feedback loops. And for those of you who work with us, feedback loops are the concept of not just putting data into the black hole, but also getting data back for decision making. So creating those feedback loops so you don't just have data, you're using your data.
And my name is Sarah, and I really like being able to export the data out of the report into an Excel file for analyzing the data and to collect data for grant reports.
Thank you. So just a couple quick housekeeping things. We're in a large group, so please mute yourself. If you have questions, we have so much to cover today. Unfortunately, we're not going to have time at the end for Q&A. However, because there's 4 of us, we can answer your questions through the chat. So please, as questions come up, go ahead and enter them in the chat, and we'll help get you some answers. And then also, if you don't get your questions answered today, remember that we have office hours next week. So on May 18th and 20th, there's office hours that you can sign up for. Either for questions you didn't get answered today, or maybe as you're doing your homework, something new comes up. So please join us for those. I also thought today, to kind of get us in, one of the things that I really love about reports is that you're constantly solving new problems. And so I thought, to get us in an adventurous, playful mood, we try a new tool in Zoom just to try out something new. So we're going to try annotation today. So to do annotation, so up on the top of your screen, hopefully you see a green bar like this. And then to the right of that, you'll see view options. So if you click on that little caret next to view options, all the admissions make my cursor not work. So when you click on the view options, you'll get this list and you'll get an option to annotate, and then select annotate, and then you'll get a new set of tools. So there's a lot of them available. Today, just to keep things simple, I thought we would try using the stamp. If you can't contain yourself and you want to try other ones, please have at it. I'm pro trying all the tools. But the one I thought we would try to use is the stamp. And you get these options. Excellent. It looks like you're figuring it out. Excellent. And the nice thing is it's anonymous too. So we'll do our interactions with the stamps. It looks like we're all getting the hang of it. So Helen is going to help clear the stamps for us, and then we'll be using it like this. So just to get us started, to help me get a sense of where everyone is, what experience do you have in building reports? Excellent. This is really helpful to see. So we've got a broad range. Not very many who have experience in Apricot. That's great. We are gonna dive in and get some practice today. Excellent. Thank you all for participating in that. Helen, if you would clear those, and we're gonna ask a new question. So as a warm-up question, answer this question using your stamp. An effective Apricot admin typically only needs to publish a report X how many times before they get it right? How would you answer this question? Again, a broad range of answers. You're not all answering.
I'm having
I'm
trouble with the annotate.
Oh,
That's
you
why
are?
I can't. Yeah.
Maybe Sarah or Helen could help you troubleshoot that, because we're going to try and use it. Hopefully we can get it to work out. Helen's going to help you out.
Okay.
Thank you for speaking up. So I'm really, really happy to see so many of you marking something to the right. Helen, Janae, and Sarah, would you circle your response to this question? I'm really challenging us with the annotation tools. Many, yes, that is where my answer would lie as well. As we dive into reports today, I wanted to address expectations. In most of our work together, when we will have a conversation about reporting requirements, we go away, we put something together and show you a finished product. So it may appear as if they're fairly easy and it's just a matter of expertise and they don't take a lot of time to create. But honestly, building reports is a matter of curiosity, persistence, and a willingness to keep tweaking until it works the way you want. So no matter how much experience you have building reports, it's still a matter of entering stuff in, trying it out, publishing, did it work, did it not, and just keep evolving it. And so I want to make sure that you're setting appropriate expectations for yourself, that it's not a matter of expertise. It truly is, building reports is a process. Kind of like on a cooking show. I don't know if you've seen a cooking show. Within half an hour, they have all their perfectly measured ingredients all organized, and they throw everything together. They put it in the oven. They pull out the perfect, beautiful thing. It's exactly at the right time and everything's perfect. So it seems like it's really easy, but in real life, it takes a little more preparation and a few more tries. And sometimes it doesn't work as expected and you just keep tweaking. So I just want to make sure we're all on the same page where reporting is really about tweaking. It's an evolution. So today we are going to cover, with reports and data visualization, we'll do a quick overview in Apricot. We'll talk about how to identify a clear objective. We'll get in and build a report. Then we'll build another report that includes a graph. We'll talk about exporting reports, and then we'll also, hopefully we'll have time to kind of go on a little tour of some interesting ways to use reports. What is a report? Simply put, a report is a display of entered data. A report in Apricot is a way to show the data that has been entered. A good report is an answer to a specific question. And similarly, what is data visualization? Simply, it's the presentation of data in a graphical or pictorial format. Data visualization is often a very effective way to consolidate large amounts of data or abstract concepts and then translate them into something more concrete. So let's get into Apricot and show around. So here, when we log into Apricot, we're in the front end. I can see I'm in under my Apricot. On the home screen here, bulletins often include reports. We won't be going into how to build a bulletin today. That'll be in the next session. But several of these bulletins are displaying reports. So we have this first one, external referral tracking. This is a simple table report. It's a simple display of information that has been entered into forms. This one is for referrals needing follow-up. So referrals have been submitted. The staff member can click on an item and open that record directly to perform their next task. Another example of a report is this youth evaluation responses. Similarly, this is another table report. It's displaying information that was entered into forms, but it's a little bit more complex in that it's been grouped. So there's some, the information has been organized and there's a little bit of interaction on the front end. To get a little bit more complex, we have some graphs. So here are some examples of demographic graphs. We have showing, this pie chart shows race of our student base, and this one shows ethnicity. Two simple graphical representations of the data that's been submitted. And then getting even more complex, we have this report, which shows two different views. It includes graphs. These are showing the intake counts. So this one is representing intake count by program. It's organizing it in one way. And then this one is organizing that same information by month. You'll see we've been thoughtful about color coding, so they're similar. We're comparing similar to similar. But again, just a visual representation of data that has been entered and organized in Apricot. So let's get into the builder and see what it looks like from the back end. So you can view, when you click view full report, let me go back to that. I didn't highlight what I was doing there. So at the bottom of any report in a bulletin, you can, the bulletin view is a little bit more condensed to make it appropriate for a bulletin. But then if you want to see all the details, you can click on view full report at the bottom here. And so that opens the report in its own window. It shows any global values that have been added, and a little bit more detail that maybe you see and bigger on the bulletin. So this, we're still in the front end. You can see I'm still in my Apricot. Let's go into the builder, which is on the back end. I could either go through administrator, but since I'm in this report, I can edit directly by under report actions, clicking on edit. So now you'll see I'm in the administrator view, I'm in the back end. And so what are all of these areas in the builder? So up here is the name, similar to a form. You've got the form name, or the report name and space for a description. These are the properties for the whole entire report. This section for global values are a date, word, or number that can be easily updated in filters throughout the entire report. So for this example, we have two reports that are built on a time period. And in this particular report, maybe you want to keep the same report, but change the date. So you only want to see a year at a time, or maybe just the last month. And so instead of having to change the filter for each report, the reports can reference the value at the top, and you change it once and it reflects on all the reports. So that's what global values are. Next are a section, so similar to a form, organized by a section. So this mini report, each section contains its own mini report. And similarly, click on the green gear to open up the properties. Within the section properties, you can select whether or not to include a graph, show percentages with a drill down. You can adjust auto run. Well, so these auto run in edit mode and auto run in run mode. So we can either have Apricot display data as we go. So that's called auto run. It's showing it, it's constantly refreshing as you make changes. And you can either turn it to be on or off in run mode, meaning when it's been published and when do you want to have to manually push a button to refresh it, or do you just want it to automatically refresh? And you can also do the same thing in edit mode. So we'll talk about some of those when you would choose either of those, but that's part of section properties. And then one thing to call out, the section name, it can feel a little bit duplicative if you have one report to repeat the report name and also the section name. But the section name becomes really important when you're displaying that report in a bulletin, because it's the section name that will show up in the bulletin, not the report name. So just something to be aware of. Moving down within the section, so this area for forms, this is the associated forms in this report. So the first field that you add to a report, and we'll get into how to do that later, but the first field that you add indicates, it determines the root form, and it must always be present. So typically you want that to be a tier 1 form. And so it acts a little bit as a filter. It's displaying these results, the records being displayed are part of these forms. And you can also have, part of these forms. And so you can also control whether that form is always present. Maybe it's sometimes present. So the tier 1 is always present, but maybe you want to display a tier 2. Maybe the record has a tier 2 or not, and we'll get into an example of that, but that's what that always means. And this is a list of all the forms represented within this report. Then we get down to filters. Similar to building logic in a form, a filter is building a conditional statement. Only include records in this report if they meet these criteria. And then we have some logic here tied to the filters. Limit sections. This isn't used very often, but it's nice to know that when including tier 2 forms, you have the option to show all tier 2 records, or you can also limit it to only show the most recent one or the first one submitted. So in certain situations, that can be really helpful. So that's this upper top of the section. And then here is the main portion of your report where you're going to build the report. Down here, I'm going to jump just because this is how you enter it in. To the right, these are all the fields that are being represented in the report. So over here under field choices, this list represents every single form and every single field in your whole entire Apricot database. So you can put any field from anywhere in a report. And to add fields to report, it's a matter of dragging and dropping. So you drag fields into this area, and each field becomes a column represented in this table. And then once you have data in these columns, you can set up graphs. And so we're going to go through all these in detail later, but just to kind of give you an overview, this is where you would control some things, your properties for the graphs. So I think with that, let's get into building one. I find it really helpful. I find it overwhelming to go into a blank report because you can bring in any field from any form to not kind of go in with a plan. So I find it really helpful to spend a couple minutes just clearly articulating what it is I'm trying to accomplish with my report. So I find this kind of Mad Libs structure helpful for me. So to start, I like to start with a clear objective and fill out this statement. As a blank, who is my audience? I need to know what specifically does this audience need to know so that I can blank take this specific action. And in articulating that, that can really help me focus. So what does that mean? Let's show an example. As a reminder, our Stronger Together is our organization that we're operating from today in this Apricot. As a Stronger Together program manager, I need to know which volunteers are available on Tuesdays or Thursdays so that I can coordinate support for the upcoming Fun with Physics after school activity that we have. So that's a very specific, clear objective. So now that I have this, what data do I need to deliver this? So I like to kind of fill out a little worksheet to kind of get my thoughts organized. So, all right, in order to deliver this objective, what information do I need? So I need to know which volunteers are available on Tuesdays or Thursdays. Well, I need to know who the volunteers are. So I need name, the days they're available, so I know if they're available on Tuesdays or Thursdays. If I'm going to coordinate support for this upcoming activity, I probably want some contact information, so probably phone number, email address. I think that's probably all I need to include. Okay, so in the next column, Now that I know what information is relevant, which form fields I'm looking at, which form are they on? So that when I go through that long list, how do I find these bits of information? Name is on volunteer profile. Actually, all of this information is on the volunteer profile. So that's fairly straightforward. Okay. So I know I'm going to bring in information from the volunteer profile. Remember when we were talking about, when I was showing that area of the form, the forms that were included, talking about a root form. The first field that you bring into a report sets the root form. And so it sets the structure for the whole report. So it's actually really important to be thoughtful about which field you drag in first. You can always rearrange them, and you have quite a bit of flexibility, but it kind of sets the structure of the report by bringing in that first field. So you want to be really thoughtful to make sure that you're bringing something in from a tier 1 form. This volunteer profile happens to be a tier 1 form. Since they're all coming from that tier 1 form, it doesn't have a big impact on this particular report, but it's something you want to be thoughtful of if you're bringing in data from multiple forms, to be thoughtful about which one you bring in first. Okay, so now I know what fields I'm bringing in. I know which forms they're on. I want to think about filters, because we're not displaying all the data on all the records from this form. We're displaying a subset. So how do we control that? So we need to think through what the logic for our filters would be. So only include records when what? In this particular report, we only want to include records for when the volunteers are available on Tuesdays or Thursdays. So we're going to build a filter that's related to the days they're available. So as a Stronger Together program manager, I need to know which volunteers are available on Tuesdays or Thursdays so that I can coordinate support for the upcoming Fun with Physics after school activity. I think I've got all that represented. Oh, I'm going to need to know whether the volunteers are active or not. We have some previous volunteers that are still in our system but are no longer active. So I only want to include them if they're available. That's also on the volunteer profile. And so I want to include a filter for if their status is active or accepted. All right, I feel like I feel pretty organized now. I've got a list of fields to bring in. So let's go ahead and get into Apricot. All right, so to build a report, right now I'm in the front end. Building reports is an administrative function, so I need to go into the back end under administrator. And then in the gray bar on the left here, I'm going to go into the report center and reports. So when I go in here, I can see all the reports in our system. They're organized by categories. Today, I'm building reports for our Stronger Together category. And so this shows a list, which is helpful. It includes who last modified this report, the date that happened, so that can be helpful. But to create a new, you come over here to report actions, create new report. And again, you have to select the category. So Stronger Together reports, and give it a name. So for this report, based on our objective, we're going to call this report the Fun with Physics volunteer activity, and create. This is very similar to creating a form. It has now created my report. It has a name. I find it really helpful to include my objective in the description for the report. Someday when I win the lottery and the next administrator comes in behind me and needs to understand what each report is for, it can be really helpful to kind of have this overview so that they don't have to do quite as much detective work. So I like to add in that description. That'll display in that front area under the descriptions for all your reports. All right, so I have, I've put in my name, I've put in my description. So now it's time to start dragging in fields. So over here again, under field choices, this is all of the forms in your whole entire database and all of the fields. So it can be a little overwhelming. They're organized in the same way they are in the forms section. So I'm looking for volunteer profile. All of the data that I'm bringing in is from the volunteer profile. So I want to bring in, so when you open up the form, then you see the sections. So I don't think I called that out before. This first level is a tier, indicates it's a tier 1 form. When they're indented, that's a tier 2 form. When you open up a form, it shows the sections. So it's displaying a hierarchy to keep it a little organized. I need volunteer name. I'm going to bring in, so I just drag and drop, drag, and when you see this little green highlight, you know that Apricot is paying attention to you. And so I've added a field. So I'm going to bring in the last name as well. This is where that auto run is helpful. So the default is to not have auto run on. I personally find it really helpful to turn that on because it gives me an example of the type of data I'm bringing in, which can just be helpful to make sure that, that I brought in the right field, that I'm remembering correctly, and also just to understand how it's going to display. So I like to turn that on when I have a simple report. It can bog the report down if you have a big report or multiple sections with a lot of data. It's constantly refreshing, and so that can make it really time consuming. So in that case, I would probably turn it off. But in this case, it's simple and I want to see that, so I have turned it on. So I also want to bring in that contact information. There's a contact information section. I want to bring in phone number. I want to bring in email address. And then I also wanted to bring in status. That was that extra filter that I was going to need to bring in. And so I'm going to come up to the volunteer profile and bring in status. And so no matter where I drag something in, it will always bring it in on the right here. Once it's in, I can move it wherever I'd like. I can drag and drop. But it's helpful to know that no matter where you try to drag it in, it's going to go to the right. So it's a two-step process to move it where you'd like. So it's helpful to see the information. You can rename any of these columns. So in this example, primary phone, the name of that field made sense on the form, but here I don't, that's a little bit too much. I just need, it can just say phone. So I just change the name and apply. Another thing that you can do, which is kind of cool, is in the form, first name and last name, those are two separate fields, which makes sense on the form. But in this report, I would like to see the name as one single unit, which is something you can do. There's the section up here under field choices called special columns, and there are some calculation columns. So there's several, depending on the type of data that you're entering into the field, perhaps you need to do a calculation of numbers. Maybe you need to do a calculation of dates so you can calculate time. In this example, I'm going to do a text calculation, which is pretty cool because I can combine any text, any field text from any of the fields that I would like. So I move it over here next to name and click on the green gear to open up the properties. And so in this calculation columns is where I tell Apricot which columns I want to include. So this will display all of the columns that I've brought into my report already. And so I want to include the first name. I could include last right here, but if I did that, it will, there's no space between them because Apricot doesn't know that there should be a space. And so I need to manually put that in. And the way to do that is to add an extra thing. Unfortunately, you can't drag and drop and rearrange these, which is a bit of a bummer, but I want to add a space in between, and that's called a static value. So I indicate that I want to do a static value, and I just type in a space. And then again, here I select last name. So now that's how I create a space in the name. And you can put anything in there you want. You can change the punctuation. You could add words that will always be between those. So there's quite a bit of flexibility there. Oh, and now that I've done this, I'm going to want to make sure that I change the name of the field so that it makes sense. Text calc isn't very useful, so I will just say name. But now that I have this combined name, I don't also need to show their name again separately. So I'm going to hide these fields. So I'm going to go in the green gear, expand formatting, and say hidden yes. The default is that they are not hidden. But I want this one to be hidden. So I'll say yes and apply. And you'll see now the gear has turned to gray, which indicates that it's hidden. It's still visible in this administrator view because you want to know what fields you have involved. Again, formatting, hidden, yes. All right. All right, I think I've got all the information in that I need. I need to put in those filters though. So let's build some filters. Scrolling to the right across from filters, I click on this little plus, which opens filter properties. And so which piece of data do I want to build the filter on? It'll bring in all of the columns that I have in my report. Another kind of handy thing is that it brings in all searchable fields, all the fields that are searchable within the forms represented in this report. So that can be really handy when you're building a form to be thinking about which fields to be including is searchable, can be handy for report building. But here I'm only going to be, we are building a filter based on the days they're available. So I am going to use status, is that right? Oh, I didn't even bring in the days, the most important part. Oops. So now that let's delete this. We're gonna delete that filter and start over. So I forgot to bring in the availability. That's a critical element of this report. Which day are they available? Let's move that over here. All right, so now that that data is available in my report, now I can go and build a filter based on it. So this filter is based on availability. And what is the condition? When availability, and this is dependent upon the type of field that it is. If it's a number-based field, there will be options like more than, less than, equals. A text field, you might have to type in your value. This particular field was built as an option field, a checkbox field. So I know that there are a limited number of choices. We've put in the days of the week so they can only choose what we provided. So in this case, I want to do matches any of is the one I'm going to select, which then gives me all of the options that were provided in the form. So I don't have to remember correctly or risk spelling it wrong. I can choose. I only want to see the records that indicate Tuesday or Thursday. And then I click apply. And so you'll notice now there were records for all the days of the week, but now I'm only seeing records that include Tuesday or Thursday. And if you'll notice over here in the status, this is another reason it's really helpful to see the data, examples of the data you've brought in, because sometimes it helps you realize that you need to do some more filtering. In this case, so far we're showing both an inactive, no longer volunteering record and a prospect, and I don't want those to show. So I'm going to build another filter for status. And again, this was another option field. So I want to use matches any of, and I want to choose, I only want to show records that are this particular option. So I'm going to hit apply. Oh, I did it wrong. I don't want to be showing only the inactive. I want to show the active. Oops. So there we go. Now I got it fixed. So I'm only showing records that are Tuesdays or Thursdays where the status of the volunteer is active and accepted. All right. So now how should this data be organized? I have all the data in, but it's a lot. How can I get it organized to answer our objective? So I want to see which volunteers are available on Tuesdays or Thursdays so I can coordinate. Well, maybe it would be nice to maybe group by day of the week. So let's try that. I'm going to group by this column by clicking on that green gear and just choosing group by this column. Yes. Well, that's interesting. There was a record that shows all the days of the week, which I want to include this person because they meet my criteria. They are available on Tuesdays or Thursdays. But the way that it's organized doesn't necessarily make sense. So maybe I'll take that grouping off. And maybe instead I'll sort. So under formatting, I can change the sort order. So the default is whatever is in the first column will be alphabetical. No matter what your first column is, it'll assume alphabetical unless you change it elsewhere. So instead of alphabetical by first name, I want these to sort by order of day. So I'll say ascending. But because Apricot is just looking at the names, the the days of the week as words. It doesn't know that they have a special order in a week. So it's going alphabetical. So TH comes before TU in the alphabet. So ascending gets the wrong direction for me. So what I actually want to do in this case to make it work the way that I want to see it is I'm going to select descending. And now Tuesday happens to show up before Thursday, which is going to make more sense for me. So now I'll click apply. All right, I think I've got that all organized. Let's go ahead and publish. Are you sure you want to publish this report? Yes. Once you publish, you'll get this little success note. Would you like to run this report? Sure. So now it's running. You'll see that it's showing you in the front end what the report looks like. You see our description that we added is at the top, which is kind of handy. It's showing details. I can't edit the details because the default is to have them locked, but they're showing them. And this is what my report is going to look like, which, yeah, that looks great. Oh, but I forgot to name my section. So I'm going to go back here. It opens up, when it runs, it opens up this separate run window. I'm going to go back to the builder view in administrator. And I'm going to rename my section. So I'm going to click on the green gear to edit. And I want to, here it's just the same. The section is named the same as the name of the report. So I'll hit apply. Helen, would you clear the stamps? All right, so now I've got it, my section named. I think I've got that ready. So I'm going to publish again. Are you sure? Yes. Would you like to run? Sure. And so now I've got my section name. Excellent. So from this, I think I'm done with this report. So now something to know, once you've run this report, there's a couple things you can do with it. So you can print, which is handy. Maybe you need to print a hard copy. Maybe you need to print to a PDF to send to someone who isn't in Apricot. So by printing, it opens up this view. There's some options, and then you can go ahead and click print. You can either print to a printer or print to a PDF, like with most other systems. So that's handy to know that that's possible. We'll close that. And we'll go back into this run view. You can also export, which is really handy. So in this particular example, perhaps this program manager is going to send an email to all of the volunteers to try to coordinate this upcoming event. They could go in and click on each individual, copy and paste the email address and build their email. Or a faster way to do it is to click on export. And this will export the data to an Excel document. So I have a couple of different configuration options. I'm going to choose Excel. That's just the standard Excel format. Something that can be helpful by default, when this exports, it's going to create two tabs in your Excel spreadsheet. One that displays all the data, and then another one that shows the groupings, just because that's the way that the data is organized in Apricot, but it's like totally useless for me as a program manager. So that's what this section is about, total row count worksheets. I don't need a separate sheet just to show me the totals. So I'm going to show none. That just helps make it a little simpler. Otherwise, most of those settings work for me. So I'm going to go ahead and click export. So down here, you'll see, oops, so I've got this report. I can click on the caret and open. So it's opening Excel slowly. We wait. It's verifying. My apologies. I should have had Excel open so that we didn't have to wait for this lovely 3 seconds. But basically, it's opening the Excel document. Any moment now, it will open my Excel spreadsheet. It's thinking really hard. All right, I'm going to let that keep working on it, and then we will move on. Was there anything else with this report? Something else that's important to remember when you're done building your report exists in the system, but that doesn't mean anybody can see it. no one can see this report until you provide permission to it. So you'll need to go back into your report builder in the administrator view and go to access control, users, and then give access. We won't go through that today, but when you build your report, make sure that you give access. And if that's something you would like some help with, that's a great thing to come to office hours with. We can help walk you through and help make sure you're, everyone who needs to see a particular report can see that report. All right, while we're doing that, my spreadsheet finally opened. And so I will bring that here so you can see. So this is what it created. Let's make it a little bit bigger so you can see. We'll select all these and double click to expand. And so we can see this information. So now, instead of going into each of those records individually, I can just select this column, copy, and then paste into my email, and that's way quicker. So that's one good use of export for email addresses. There's some limitations within Apricot that where reporting can be much more robust in Excel. So maybe you need to manipulate the data in a certain way or combine information from various sources. So being able to export is a really handy function. So, all right, I think we're done with that. We've built our first report. So let's see if you were listening. So true or false? You can change the name of a column to anything you want. So please get out the annotation again and get out your stamps. True or false? You can change the name of a column to anything you want. You're all so smart. You were paying attention. Yes, that is true. Oops. You can, okay, true or false? You can combine data from multiple fields to display as one. Yes, true. I think that's a really cool feature. There's some really interesting ways that you can combine data to make it a little bit more efficient. So you're not just limited to how you created your fields and your forms. You have a little bit more flexibility, which is great. You can sort days of the week so they appear in the same order as on the calendar. True or false? Yes, this one's not quite as clear, is it? Technically, it's false because there's no option like put in order of days of the week. However, we were able to manipulate it so that we got them in the order that we wanted. So technically, I mean, yes, you can sort the days of, you can sort them so that they get in the right order, but it wasn't an option, but you're all right. All right, let's build another one. So let's start with a clear objective. In this particular situation, as a Stronger Together program manager, I need to know total volunteer hours by month so I can report data to my funder. I'm not sure if any of you will have this need. I think this is something we all need to do on a regular basis. So let's build a report for that. What data do I need to answer this objective? In order to deliver this, I'm going to need volunteer hours. I need to know what the hours, how many hours there were, the date, because I need to report by month. I need to know what date they were logged on. I don't necessarily need to report the names, but I'll need to organize them by ID. I need to at least understand who logged these hours. And honestly, I think that's really all I have to capture. Okay, great. So which form is it on? Volunteer hours, those are on a volunteer timesheet. The date is also logged in a volunteer timesheet. The name, however, because the volunteer timesheet is a tier 2, the name isn't duplicated there. That's on a tier 1, which is the volunteer profile, which brings us to the next column. Which field should I bring in first? Even though I was thinking about hours and the date first, those aren't on a tier 1, those are on a tier 2 form. So I want to make sure that I bring in the something from the volunteer profile first. Even though I wasn't thinking of it first, it's important to make sure that I'm bringing in a tier 1 data from a tier 1 form first. Great. So what about filters? Only include records when this field, well, probably only if they have volunteer hours. I don't need to report on any data that doesn't include volunteer hours. So I only need to include them if there are entries for the volunteer timesheet. So seems simple enough. Let's go build it. So again, we'll get into Apricot, we'll go into the Administrator tab, Report Center, Reports, and I see all of my reports here, and I'm going to create, under Report Actions, I'm going to create new report. Again, this will be in the Stronger Together Reports category, and this one I'm going to name Volunteer Hours by Month. So that creates my new report. To help me stay organized, I'm going to click on the green gear to enter my objective in the description. All right. And I'm also, while I'm thinking about it, going to go ahead and name my section. I'm going to click on the green gear to name my section with volunteer hours by month. All right, so if we remember, I want to make sure that I'm bringing from the tier 1 record, the tier 1 form first. So I'm going to scroll down. Volunteer profile. So I'm bringing in data from these two forms, the volunteer profile and the volunteer timesheet, but I want to make sure I bring in the tier 1 first. So I'm going to bring in, instead of name, on this one, I think I don't really need to know what their name was. So I'm going to take the record ID, which is an automated field. It's part of every single form. It's in a hidden section. You don't often need to reference it, but it's handy to know that there's always a unique ID in every record. And so that's the one I'm going to bring in, just so there's a unique identifier. Also because it's related to this tier 1 form, and I need something from the tier 1 form. So I bring that in. I don't see any data, so I'm going to click here to display the data. Great. It might help me while I'm building to know who these records are representing. So one really interesting thing, when you bring in that record ID, one of the options for the data style is to normal just shows the ID, but you can also show with identifier fields, which is kind of cool. This references, so it'll add, in addition to the record ID, it also shows whatever is set for the form as the record name field. So you know that thing when you're building a form and you get all the way to the you think you're done and you hit publish, but it won't let you publish because you forgot to set your record name field, which I do every time. I forget every time. So that record name field, which is what displays when you open a record, that's also what displays here as the identifier. So that's kind of handy. So yeah, I'll keep that showing and hit apply. All right, so now I need to bring in the rest of the data, which was the volunteer hours and the date that those were logged. And so those are on the volunteer timesheet under main. So I could individually drag those fields in like we did before, but another way to do it when you're bringing in a bunch of fields from a particular form is you can do a bunch of them at the same time. So to do that, you come down here to add multiple columns. So I click on that, and that opens up this dialog that again shows all the forms in my Apricot. And I can scroll down again to find volunteer profile. And the volunteer timesheet is the one I want to bring in. So when we expand main here, you can see that there's 4 fields. If I click on this little plus next to main, it'll say, are you sure you want to add all 4 columns? And I say, yes, I do, up in this little yellow box, confirm. And so that's going to bring in all 4 fields from this form at one click. You can also, if you don't need all of them, you can take them off. So in this case, I don't really need volunteer activity. So I'll select that and click on this back arrow, and then it bumps it back to the list of the options. So now I've moved a couple over, and when I hit apply, those 3 extra columns come in all at once. So in this case, with only 2 more fields I needed to bring in, it's not that big of a deal. I could have dragged them in individually, but it's kind of nice to know that that's an option. All right. So now, so I've got my date in. This particular report is talking about month. So to make things easier, I'm going to change how the date column is formatted. There's actually a lot of choices. So when you click on the green gear to open up the column properties for date columns have a lot of options for data style. You can show normal displays it the way it is here, month and day, by quarter, by age, by year. So there's a lot of different options here. For this particular report, because I'm needing to show by month, I'm going to go ahead and choose month and year. And because now I've selected month and year, date doesn't feel quite as relevant. So I want to be, I want to be a little more specific. So I'm going to come back up here and change the name. I'm going to say, month when hours were logged, and hit apply. Great. So now it's a little more clear information for the people that are going to be looking at my report. And this one is fairly straightforward. I've got in the month, I've got in the hours. And so really it's just a matter of organizing them. So when I need to think about filters also. So before we get into organization, how do I, for this particular one, we only wanted to bring in when volunteer hours existed. So in this case, we don't need to manually build a filter by default. This report will only show records that have a volunteer profile and have a volunteer timesheet. So it is possible to set this to sometimes. So maybe there are definitely situations where you would want to select something other than always, but this is a handy structure for this report because it's only going to bring in records that meet the criteria of having a volunteer timesheet, and my whole report is about the volunteer timesheet. So that works really well as my filter. I don't need to create a separate filter. So I don't need to do anything additional for the filter. So now how should this data be organized to answer our objective? Do we need to summarize a large set of data? So just seeing individual hours isn't enough. I want to see it by month. So to do that, I need to get a total. I want total hours by month. So I'm going to click on the green gear to open up the column properties. And I am going to, I want a total. So that's a summary of this particular column. I want a summary. I want a total. So there are other options. I can select average. I can show the minimum or maximum value. I can show I can count the distinct. So how many different times does the value of 4 appear? In this particular case, though, I want to show total. I need total number of hours by month. So I select total for this column, which is great. I now have a summary for this column, which is 223 total hours, but I need to have it organized by month. So more than just the total for the total, I need total by month. So I need to group it by the month column. So I'm going to click on the properties for the month when the hours were logged, and I'm going to group by this column and say yes. All right, great. So now I have a total, because they're grouped, I have a total for each month. So now it's organized the way I need. I would love to see this represented visually. So I'm going to make a graph. So to add a graph, I go up into the section properties, click on the green gear, and show graph, yes. All right, so now I have a graph. Apricot made a bunch of assumptions for me. Sometimes they're right, usually they're not. So I have to go in and make some changes, but I have a graph, which is helpful. So I see that I remember my total for January being 20, but this is saying 4. That's not right. So what's going on? So I click on the green gear to change the properties for the graph, and I see that the data source assumes group counts. So it's assuming count of records. There are 4 records entered in the month of January. So it's displaying 4. In this case, I want a summary. I want to reference the summary that I made for my hours column. So instead of group counts, I'm going to change data source to summaries. All my data went away. Well, that's because I didn't tell it which summaries to use. Apricot doesn't make any assumptions. So now that I've selected summaries, I need to tell it specifically what I want to do. So there's this new section called summaries, and I click on plus. And so now it will make a list of all the summaries that I've put into this report. This one, we've only built one summary, so it's pretty straightforward. But I'm going to select total hours and apply. That looks more like what I expected. So now it's showing January, a value of 20, which is what I expected, 20 total hours for the month of January. Excellent. All right, so let's go back into those graph properties and talk about some of the other settings. There are a lot of graph types you can use. So let's go through kind of an overview of what they all are. Apricot will make an assumption based on the type of data that you're showing what the best graph would be. Sometimes it gets it right, sometimes it doesn't. It's just making an assumption. It's easy to change. So a pie graph, you've probably seen these before. Pie graphs are great to show a part to whole relationship. It's easy to see that of the total hours, February was the biggest chunk, but that's not what we're wanting to show. We're wanting to show comparison of the different months. So a pie chart won't be appropriate for this. A donut chart is basically just a pie chart with a hole in the middle. Yum. Line chart. A line chart is showing, let's see, this one would make more sense, I think, as a group count, to show over time, basically representing a line. This one, it doesn't work with my summaries, and also I don't like that one, but line charts can be helpful to show change over time. An area chart is basically a line chart. Oh, let's show that this way. Is basically a line chart with the bottom area filled in. That can be helpful because the line is so skinny. Sometimes it's really helpful to see more visual volume underneath the line. We'll go back to the summaries here. A bar chart shows individual bars for each of the groupings. Anything that's grouped will show as a bar. So a bar chart makes the bars horizontal, and a column chart is the same thing, but vertical, up and down. A bubble chart, these are pretty rare. It requires 3 data points. Often I don't find them effective, but it is an option in here. There's also graph types for maps. So when you're trying to graph locations, you can use a location map or a heat map. It's not relevant for this particular situation. So we're going to choose, I like the column chart, and hit apply. All right, another thing you can do in the graph properties, I know Janae is especially partial to target lines. Target lines are fantastic because you can add information to a graph that might not otherwise be obvious. So I really like to use target lines for a goal. So in this case, it's not evident from the graph, but we actually have a monthly volunteer, a goal of 40 hours per month. So I'm going to label the line to be monthly goal, and the value is 40 hours per month. I can also change the color of this line to help it stand out. Just to make it obvious, I'm going to make it purple and hit apply. And so now this adds this target line, which makes it really, really clear which months I met my goal and which ones fell short. I find that incredibly helpful. You can use target lines for goals. Maybe you have a minimum or maximum. So you're wanting to show 2 levels and the bars should fall between. Maybe you're comparing to information from another source. Maybe like there's a standard that the state has set and you want to see how close you're coming to that. Target lines are really helpful for all kinds of those things. So that's how you set a target line. What else do you have in graph properties? There's a whole bunch of properties. If you get real specific, if you really want to control how your graph is being presented, there's a lot of property options in here. You can make the bars have rounded corners. Seems like an odd property to need to set because it's so subtle, but you can do it if you'd like. You can hide the values, you can make them vertical, you can add percent sign, you can change your decimal places, you can edit the labels, all kinds of stuff. One thing I often use is the subtitle. In this particular example, it doesn't make a whole lot of sense, but it's kind of nice when you have a bunch of charts, especially if you're showing them in bulletins where the context of the report, like you don't always have the full context of the data. So it can be helpful. Oh, I forgot to say yes. Subtitle, and then I have to tell it what my subtitle is, which you would type in something way more useful than subtitle, but just to show you what it does. sometimes it's helpful to have 2 lines of information, maybe a description for the graph and a specific identifier for the subset of data you're showing, maybe describing your filter or something. But I find that often helpful, especially when the report is going to end up on a bulletin. You can also change the colors. So graph themes and colors, let's move this to the side so you can kind of see. The standard is this group of colors. You can go grayscale if you like. I like color, so I'm going to go back to, I don't know what Fint means, but it means these colors. I'm partial to ocean, kind of like these colors. Anyway, you can change your colors. You can always add your own colors. Maybe you want to add your own branding colors. Add a color and click on it. And if you know the RGB value, you can enter those here. Otherwise, you can pick the slider and pick your favorite color. One thing that's a little bit annoying about how this is built is once I put that color in, I can't drag and drop. So for this one to show, since I only have 5 values showing, I just have to get rid of a bunch of these, delete them out of the way, and then it will show. But anyway, it's nice to know that you can edit the colors if you'd like. One note about colors, try to be really purposeful about the colors you use. When you're seeing a bunch of reports all on the same screen, it can be helpful if, for example, January is always this color, or if a particular program is always represented by red. It can be helpful when you're looking at a bunch of reports all at the same time that red always means the same thing. So something to be thoughtful about. Another thing you can do in here is change the font formatting. So I'm going to scroll a little bit so I can see my titles. One thing I often change is the size of the title. You can change the font if you like. I find I usually want the title a little bit bigger, so I can select 16, which makes it, a little bit bigger. I can change the color if I need it to stand out. Maybe I want this one to be red. Anyway, so there's some things you can do with a little control you can have over the formatting. All right, I've made my graph beautiful. I've updated my title. I think we're ready. I'm gonna publish. Are you sure? Yes. Would you like to run this report? Yes. What's it gonna look like on the front end? All right, so I've got my name, I've got my description, and I can see my graph, which looks great. Yeah, that answers my objective was, as a Stronger Together program manager, I need to know total volunteer hours by month so that I can report data to my funder. So now I can see our totals by month. I can either export the data into a spreadsheet, or I can just, I see the numbers, I can type them in where I need to. Maybe I also want to share this visual to people that don't have Apricot, or maybe I need to email it to someone, or maybe include it in a printed report. So to take the image of the graph, that's in this little, it's called a hamburger menu. Because I guess it looks like a hamburger. Anyway, I click on the little 3 lines, the stack of 3 lines, and I have a variety of options, way that I can download. So I can download JPEG. And again, similarly to how it did for the exported Excel, it downloads into my browser. I can open, and it's going to open on my other screen. So I'm going to make it a little smaller and drag it over. And so here, I made a JPEG of my graph, which can be really helpful. So that's how you do that. And I think we're done. That was a fairly simple, straightforward report. The graph looks the way I want it. So we're done. So now I would need to remember to go back into the administrator view and go and make sure that I give permission to the people that need to see this, to make sure that they have permission. But building this report kind of got me curious. It's interesting to see them by month, but what if I could also see them by volunteer? I wonder how many hours each volunteer has. One thing I really like about the report builder, in other areas of Apricot, you're kind of limited in copying, in that like you can't copy. So I find when I'm repeating similar questions, or maybe a section is repeated, you have to individually drag in every field, which gets a little laborious. In reports though, you can copy the whole report. So maybe this report is really close, but I need to show it for, for some reason I need separate reports for different time periods. I can just copy this whole entire report and make a whole separate copy of the report. I can also copy the section. So I have this section the way I want. I can just copy the whole section, which can be really helpful. I mean, this report, we've only got what, 3 or 4 fields, so it wouldn't be that time consuming to recreate, but sometimes you're building a report with like 20 different fields in it. You've set the properties for each of those columns, you've renamed them, and you just need to you need to show the data in a slightly different way, and to redo that would be so laborious. So here I can change it to you can select the report that you add it to. So you can, it assumes you want to add it to the same report you're in, but you can also select any other report in your system, which is kind of nice. Here though, what I want to see is hours by volunteer. So I'm going to change the name and select copy. And so now it's duplicated this report on the bottom. It's an exact copy. I'll click to refresh. It's an exact copy of what I did before. So great. So now I can make a couple changes. So I want to see hours by volunteer. In this one's grouped by month, which no longer makes sense for volunteer. So I'm going to remove the grouping from month. I'm just going to say group by this column, no. So then you'll see my report doesn't have anything, my graph doesn't have anything to assume, which is fine. We'll get to that later. I've removed the grouping from month, and I'm going to change the grouping to record ID to show which volunteer. So group by this column, yes. And so now it's grouped, each individual has a grouping with the total hours. And so now my graph makes the correct assumption, and it's showing, I have lots of volunteers, so that's a lot of bars, but it's showing by volunteer. And now I'm noticing that target line I'd set doesn't make sense because these aren't organized by monthly goal. So I can easily go in there and change. Maybe we have maybe there's a special volunteer level once they reach a certain number of hours or something. Once they get to say 20 hours, that achieves special volunteer status. So I hit apply. And so then that's a quick way to, I don't have to recreate my target line. I just edit the one that was in there. So now this again is meaningful. I can see the totals by volunteer, which is what I was seeking to do, but I also have this extra information of a comparison against a goal or a standard or whatever else. One other thing I want to do, this is mostly all I need. I can keep the month when the hours are logged, but maybe maybe that's not as helpful anymore. Maybe I just want to go back to the Norma data style. So now that I've made a copy, it's now separate from that other report. Making changes to this one don't impact that first report. It was just a quick way to create a starting point for this one and hit apply. Oh, I didn't actually change my name, or I changed the style, but I didn't change the name. So I'll just say hours. When I move my mouse, it takes away my dialog box. Hours logged, and apply. Great. So I think we're done. One also helpful thing to know is that you can delete sections easily. Once you've published something on a form, you have to deactivate, but in reports, you can straight up delete, which is nice. Also, be careful because it straight up deletes. So be careful because you're not deactivating. Once you delete, it's gone. But in certain situations, you no longer need it, and it's nice to be able to kind of clean up. All right. How did we do? True or false? Pie charts are a good choice for all reports. Is that true or false? Oh, that warms my heart. True, that is correct. Pie charts are not a good choice for all reports. They are fantastic for showing a part-to-whole relationship, but they're really hard to see comparison of values one to the other. The eye just can't distinguish. So you are correct. Target lines are a helpful way to highlight a goal. True or false? I think I made my love for target lines fairly clear. You're right. True. I find them, I guess that's a subjective true or false question, but I find them super helpful. You can copy a section of a report or a whole report. Ah, interesting. This one is true. You can do either. You can copy, and the place that you do that, maybe let's go take a quick look at that. Helen, would you clear the stamps? Thank you. To copy the whole report, you do that under report actions and copy report. That'll make a copy of this whole entire report, the name, the sections, the global values, all of it. If I just want to copy a section, so maybe I want to, like we just did in the last example, if I just want to duplicate what I did, but maybe make a couple tweaks, then I do that in the section properties and I can just copy there. So yes, you can copy a section of a report, or you can copy the report as a whole. All right, so now we still have a little bit of time. In the examples that we of the building reports within our sandbox Stronger Together, it's hard to show all the capabilities, and certainly we don't have time to show all of them now, but I thought it would be helpful at least to give some examples of some helpful ways to use reports. So I thought we'd go on a little tour of just different examples of reports. So Helen was going to kick us off and talk about some of her reports.
Thanks, Heather. So this is one example of a stacked bar chart, and following the logic example of, as a program manager, I want to know how many people attended each session, group, or class my program offered. Here it's showing from the months of January to March, and we see the total number of clients who attended. I want to report this information to my funder, and you can see the colors here differentiate between present and absent clients. Here's a second one, what is often used as a monthly report for BSK. We want to report how many new participants were enrolled in our program each month. So another beautiful example of a bar chart, new participants, and then returning participants served each month. So we thought it would be helpful to show these examples because they're more aligned with what you all are doing on a regular basis. And Heather did such a great job of touring reports with the data we had in our sandbox. So yeah, I'll pass it on to Janae, I believe.
Thanks, Helen.
Yeah, so this is a report. So just going through the kind of Mad Lib. As a program manager, I want to know if new visits or births have been submitted so I can monitor data quality and perform CQI checks. So this is obviously for some kind of doula or home visiting program, but this is actually a 2-section report. So the top report is anytime a new home visit is submitted, it will appear in this report and will remain there until it is reviewed by a supervisor. The bottom is the same. It's when a new labor or birth form is submitted, it will remain on a dashboard until reviewed by a supervisor. So it's a way to not only see the data, but it's a way for supervisors and managers to be able to see what their staff are doing and also check data quality as you go. So when it comes time to do that big report, you're not sifting through months and months worth of data. You've been doing your data quality checks along the way.
Nice. How about this one, Sarah?
Hi. So in this case, we created a bulletin that gave a program director who was working with a program that has 7 organizations in it, and each one submits their own monthly BSK report. So she wanted to be able to look in one place and see whether all 7 reports had been submitted and which ones were missing, so she could send reminders and get them all in on time. So as you can see at the top, it says organization A. And if they had submitted that month, it would show the name of the month and the year. So for example, it says April 2021, so they submitted their report. If it only went through March, they had not submitted their report. Really, another nice thing for CQI, for data quality checks, is you'll see there's a little arrow to the left of the month. And when you click that in the real bulletin, it will display the actual data. And if something looks like it's missing or isn't right, she can click on that row and go directly to the report and see, to the record that that person submitted for their monthly BSK report, and take a look, and then get back to that organization and say, what did you mean by this? Or you need to fill out these 2 fields. So that's really a handy, easy way to take a look.
Thank you. Oops. Kind of in that same vein, here's one. As a staff member, I want to know details from the most recent participant contact for all active participants organized by staff member. This is a more complex one, but kind of in the same vein of displaying information, representing the workflow, the process of the work that I do in the report. I want to see these details so that I can effectively keep track of all my active participants. So in this particular example, this is showing a list of all active participants organized by staff name, and then it's bringing in details from some tier 2 forms to see what's the most current. So it's a nice quick display. And this one, I wanted to, since we have a little bit of time, something I think is really interesting. This is definitely more advanced report building, but I think it's helpful to know that that this is possible. So in here, when we remember, we were talking about how you can, Apricot assumes that a form needs to always be present, but you can click on where it says always, and it'll open up this properties window, and you can change it to sometimes. So maybe maybe the tier 2 form doesn't always exist. You want to bring in the record. It will always have the tier 1, but it may or may not have the tier 2. So these records will be included whether or not they have this tier 2 record. Another thing, which is definitely not used frequently, but it's handy when you do need it, is you can limit. So when you're bringing in a bunch of tier 2 records, maybe for case notes, you have maybe hundreds of case notes for a particular participant. You don't want to bring in all those records. So you can select that I only want to bring in the last created, or maybe I only want to show the first created. So, so that's kind of helpful. So just a handy thing that in limited situations can be helpful to know that that's a possibility. So that wraps up our quick overview of how to build reports in Apricot. So I was curious, what is something helpful that you learned today? I love all the heart stamps. Nice. I am so excited for you all to get into building reports. This is probably an important time to mention that building reports is functionality that's only available to administrators and to some super users. So that's going to be specific to your organization. It's helpful, I think, to know what's possible, but if you are not an administrator or a super user, you won't have the capabilities to do these things. But whether or not you're going to immediately go build reports or not, it's helpful to know what's possible and how to think about report building. Even when you're building your forms or thinking about forms, it's helpful to know how that data can be then displayed afterwards. So thank you. Oops. All right, so that brings us to a reminder of the portal. So Sarah is going to share a link for the portal. The portal is where you will go to get your homework. Homework number 3 is now available in the portal. A reminder that this is also where you can sign up for office hours. So if you didn't have a chance to get your question answered today, or as you're working on your homework, or you're working on a report just as a normal part of your job and you have some questions, or you just want to brainstorm with somebody, we love to talk about reports. I love to talk about nothing more than reports. So please sign up for office hours. A reminder, when you sign up for office hours, you will get an email with the Zoom link in it. You won't get an invite. So be purposeful. Once you sign up and submit, you need to go check your email, check your spam, just in case the portal notifications are going into your spam. But and then you'll need to add it to your calendar. You will get the Zoom link in that email. But you'll need to go set it up on your calendar. And then just to call out, if for some reason we don't have your information entered correctly in the portal, you can change that. You go up to this little caret next to your name once you're in the portal. You click on that, and then you click on account information, and then you can update if we don't have your name spelled correctly, or maybe the organization isn't labeled correctly. So just know, I wanted to make sure you knew how to do that. But I especially wanted to talk about homework. What is our homework this week? I'm so glad you asked. So this week, session 3 homework is to indulge one of your personal curiosities about your organization. In the case where you're only ever getting, only building reports to answer other people's questions, this is a chance to ask your own question. Like, what are you curious about? You know the data in your system. What's something in a very low risk way you could just practice with, like trying to display, ask yourself a question and see if you can get that to display in Apricot. So the homework is to clarify a specific objective based on the data in your Apricot, build a report which answers that objective, and then to submit your homework, you would export your report to an XLSX like we did, and upload that in the portal. And if you forgot how to do that, there's a reminder in the portal how to do that, specific steps how to export. And then if you really want to go extra and get extra credit, add a graph to that report to visualize the answer to your question. It just takes time to play with graphs. So it's kind of nice to have a pretend purpose to go in and play with that when there's no risk. So to submit that, you'll download a JPEG. And similarly, if you've forgotten how to do that, there's a reminder in the portal. All right, so what's next? Please take our session evaluation. Sarah is going to share the link for that. Our goal is to help you become more and more confident in your role as an administrator. And so we're hoping that these sessions help you with that. But if they're not, if they are, help us know what is really helpful for you. And if they're not, help us know what we could do better to help you feel more confident and comfortable in your role as an admin. You will be getting a follow-up email afterwards. The follow-up email will have a quick guide for Apricot reports and data visualization. So it'll include that worksheet we went over to help build a report, some overview, some links to knowledge-based resources that we find really helpful in building reports, a whole page on graph options, kind of going through the details of when a particular graph is good or not, and some tips and tricks, and then just an extra page with the worksheet to articulate your objectives. So again, your homework for session 3 is to create a report. It can be as simple or as complex as you'd like, just a chance to practice building a report. And a reminder plug for office hours. They're next week, May 18th and 20th. For real, there's nothing I love talking about more than reports. So please come, let's talk reports. We can answer questions that you have. We can just geek out on reports and talk about reports and graphs. When there's several of us, we can help each other brainstorm and think about things in different ways. So please join us. We're about at time, but we do have like 2 or 3 minutes. If there are any questions, what questions do you have? If you don't have questions, thank you so much for attending, and we'll see you next time. But if there are questions,